soul leads to a demented mind. These wicked minds create a life of pain, death, torture, often making one ponder the capacity of a human being and the depravity and acts a person can commit on their victims. As for these three men, the abuse and instability in their lives would create horrendous monsters. But sadly, these monsters were real.
Perfect. I'm gonna make you smile, man.
In 1948, Clarnell Elizabeth Kemper would give birth to her only son, Edmund. As a child, Ed lived a dysfunctional life with his family, often showing antisocial behavior and cruelty to animals. Possession and control were pleasure to him, even at a young age. Through his own admission, some of his favorite games to play as a child were the gas chamber and the electric chair, where a sibling of his would pretend to execute him, and he would seize on the floor until he was dead. In interviews following his arrest, Kemper made more troubling admissions to his childhood, including the near-death experiences caused twice by his sister, being molested, and stalking a second-grade teacher, watching outside her windows at night while he carried a bayonet his father owned. Following his parents' divorce, Kemper would continue showcasing behavior indicative of a serial killer, often exemplified by things such as antisocial behavior, animal cruelty, abuse from family in forms of mental, physical, and sexual, bedwetting, and a fascination of fire. Eventually, Kemper went to live with his paternal grandparents, who Kemper described as senile, and that his grandmother often made him feel emasculated. Clearly, his hatred for women would soon turn into something much more sinister, and those early signs of a future serial killer turned into a reality, as Ed Kemper would kill his grandparents at their home in 1964, at the age of 15. When asked why, Kemper simply said, "I wanted to see what it felt like to kill Grandma." Following an argument, Ed shot his grandmother Maud with a rifle 3 times, including a shot to her head, and then proceeded to stab her several times for reasons still unknown. When his grandfather came home, he was shot in the driveway, where Kemper was left waiting for the police while telling his mother what he did. After his arrest, Kemper was sent to the Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security facility that houses mentally ill convicts, of which Kemper was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. For 5 years, Kemper remained at Atascadero, where the hospital stated he showed no expression of delusion, no bizarre thinking, and that he was extremely intelligent, recording an IQ above 135. The staff believed the diagnosis previously given to Kemper was wrong, and instead, he was later diagnosed as having a mild personality trait disorder with being passive-aggressive. If it wasn't clear though, Kemper was a master manipulator, becoming a model prisoner by all reports, only for more killings to come. On his 21st birthday, Kemper was released to his mother in 1969, also getting his juvie record expunged just 3 years later, the last report on him saying things like,
"If I were to see this patient without having any history available, or getting any history from him, I would think that we're dealing with a very well-adjusted young man who had initiative, intelligence, and who was free of any psychiatric illnesses."
After attending community college and being rejected to join the police force due to his large 6'9" frame, Kemper later found employment for the state of California, but the troubles at home continued with his mother, as often, arguments and screaming could be heard by the neighbors. 1 year before his juvenile record was expunged, Kemper was injured in 1971, injuring his arm in a motorcycle accident and receiving over $15,000 as compensation, of which he used to purchase a Ford Galaxy, the vehicle that would see the ending of far too many innocent lives. For the next 2 years, Kemper was peaceful, picking up over 150 hitchhikers on his drives, plenty of which Kemper admitted there was zero homicidal or sexual thoughts of. These urges he called his little zapples, and soon he came to act on these urges, as they began to grow into a nightmare and a reality. This nightmare would include the sick and sadistic murder of 8 people, including the decapitation of his own mother. Ed Kemper, later dubbed the Co-Ed Killer, believed his victims to be surrogates for his final target, his abuser, his mother. saying that the young women deserved it, blaming them, stating they would flaunt in his face they could do anything and get away with it. If this sounds familiar, we too commonly hear similar beliefs from incel culture. Women are to blame for all of men's problems. Therefore, the pain and suffering and hate on women is justified by this disgusting mindset. From 1972 to 73, Kemper killed 5 college female students, 1 high school female student, his mother, and his mother's friend, Mary Ann Pesci, Anita Lucchesa, Aiko Koo, Cindy Shaw, Rosalind Thorpe, Alice Liu, Clarnell Strandberg, and Sarah Hallett. His first victims were Mary Ann and Anita, 2 18-year-old college students from Fresno State University, who were handcuffed, strangled, stabbed, and their bodies so mutilated it left cops in shock. Kemper committed vile acts, and even engaged in acts of sexual intercourse with the corpses' severed heads, later dismembering the rest of them to get rid of the evidence. Sadly, after murdering them and driving home, Kemper was stopped by a cop who failed to notice the bodies in the trunk of his car. After spotting, he had a broken taillight, and just 5 months later, Kemper would take his next victim, Aiko Koo, later stuffing her body in a suitcase after killing her, even admitting to admiring her body in the suitcase like a fisherman would admire a trophy fish, doing so after a few drinks from the bar. 4 months later, in 1973, Kemper moved back in with his mother, later burying the head of his next victim in his mother's garden, letting the severed head stare up at her bedroom window, as Ed said his mother always wanted people to be looking at her. Cindy Shaw was just 18. Less than a month later, Kemper would kidnap and kill 2 more students, Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu. This was after local universities and campuses were alerted to the suspected serial killer in the area, kidnapping young college-age women who were hitchhiking. Advice was given, only to accept rides from vehicles with official university stickers and permits, of which Ed Kemper was able to obtain, as his mother worked at the UC Santa Barbara. In similar manner, Kemper would have sex with the deceased bodies after mutilating them. When asked why he would decapitate his victims, Kemper said the head was a trophy. The head is where everything is at. The brain, eyes, mouth, that's the person. I remember being told as a kid, you cut the head off and the body dies. Well, that's not quite true. There's a lot left in the girl's body without the head. Finally, on April 20th of 1973, Kemper killed his mother with a claw hammer. His final words to her that night before she went to bed, "Good night." Kemper humiliated the corpse, throwing darts at her dismembered head, screaming at it for hours, even cutting out her tongue and vocal cords. Unable to destroy them in the garbage disposal, Kemper even found humor in that, calling it appropriate as much as she'd bitched and screamed over so many years. After a few drinks at a nearby bar, Kemper would invite his mother's friend over, where he would strangle and kill Sarah Hallett before leaving a note for the cops and driving over 1,000 miles to Colorado that night. Armed with multiple guns, Kemper became paranoid, believing to be the suspect of a massive nationwide manhunt. However, after hearing no news, Kemper called the police to report the murders as he claimed he didn't feel a point to kill anymore. The high had subsided. The thought of murder lost its purpose to him, with his mother dead. After calling the police and not being believed, Kemper called a second time and spoke to an officer he knew, later admitting to his crimes. And soon, he was captured and indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder in May of 1973. After 2 suicide attempts and a plea of insanity, Kemper was found legally sane, fully cognizant of all the actions he took, including mutilation, strangulation, rape, and cannibalism. In November, he was found guilty on all counts. His defense of insanity, including blacking out during the murders and having 2 different personalities taking over his body, was unsuccessful, and Ed Kemper was sentenced to 7 years to life for each victim. Sadistically, Kemper wanted death by torture, and knowing his favorite games to play as a kid adds a more sick level to this. Re-diagnosed with antisocial, narcissistic, and schizotypal personality disorders, Kemper again became a model prisoner. In his time, Kemper narrated over 5,000 books for charity programs and even assisted with evaluation appointment schedulings for other prisoners. But even being a model prisoner wasn't enough to get him paroled, as he remains in prison, wheelchair-bound, and suffering from heart disease and diabetes. Still considered a high risk to reoffend as of 2024, murdering 10 people in total, Edmund Kemper will live his miserable life in jail. and die. Many interviews were made with Kemper, including some of which where I got these quotes and statements from. In addition, movies about him have also been made, including the 2025 release, Ed Kemper, which I just watched on Tubi. Also, Ed Kemper was too a primary inspiration for the movie serial killer Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs. And like Buffalo Bill, Ed Kemper will die a villain and who has come to be known as the Co-Ed Killer. In what became one of the nation's most heinous cases ever, Ed Gein would live a troubled life full of abuse, depravity, and more questions than answers, as a Plainfield ghoul would be deemed unfit to stand trial by reason of insanity for his sick acts. Born in 1906, Ed Gein lived with his brother Henry and their two parents in La Crosse, Wisconsin, where his mother, Augusta, and father, George, often abused the children. George was a raging alcoholic who would beat Ed and Henry until their ears bled and rang, and their mother was a religious fanatical in the sense that all women are promiscuous tools of the devil, using stories from the Old Testament and Book of Revelation to brainwash their children into pure obedience. This soon led to Ed becoming obsessed with his mother, both in life and death. After selling a grocery store the family owned, the Geins moved to a farm where Ed became a recluse, only being able to leave the farm for school to keep in line with his mother's rules, being shamed and beaten for trying to make any friends, leading to strange mannerisms from a young age due to his social inadequacy, leading to life-altering trauma, leading to killings. Ed would often laugh at his own jokes, talking to himself. Ed remained the outcast at school according to his peers, but despite his troubles and discipline when making friends, Gein was still able to do well in school. However, his life would remain on a dark path as his love for his mother became an obsession, and Henry would soon realize just how evil his brother truly was. Henry often spoke ill of their mother, which would leave Ed in shock and often upset, festering inside. Both brothers worked as handymen together, and the community saw them as trustworthy good people, but what was hidden was a broken brotherly bond over their mother. And following the passing of their father in 1940, Henry soon planned on moving in with his new girlfriend and her children, afraid of the relationship between Ed and his mother. 4 years later, though, Henry would be found dead from suspected heart failure after the Geins started a vegetation fire on the farm that would get out of control. Once the fire started, the brothers became separated as it raged out of control. But by the time the police and firefighters arrived, Ed took the police directly to Henry's body, where they found Henry laying face down, dead. The strangest thing was that Henry was not found to have been burned or injured otherwise. Although deemed heart failure, it is heavily suspected that Ed did kill his brother in a Cain and Abel scenario. Bruises were found on Henry's head, and the official death was labeled asphyxiation from smoke, and no autopsy was completed. Shortly after Henry's death, Augusta would suffer a stroke in 1945, and then a second stroke that same year, ultimately leading to her failing health and eventual death soon after. On December 29, 1945, Augusta would die, and Ed would lose his only friend and his true love, now alone in the world. And for 12 years, Ed remained on the farm, working odd jobs, but often staying to himself, becoming more and more reclusive to others that knew him. Soon, Ed would become obsessed with adventure stories, especially those including cannibalism and Nazi atrocities. Atrocities such as turning human skin into lampshades. But Ed went undetected for more than a decade, until in 1957, when the disappearance of Bernice Worden would lead the police to a killer so sick and twisted that it truly remains too horrible to believe. But remember, evil always exists behind the darkest corners in society. At approximately 9:30 a.m. on November 16, 1957, Ed Gein would enter a hardware store where the owner, Bernice Worden, would be killed in a brutal fashion that left the sheriff in such a rage that he nearly beat Ed Gein to death. Bernice's body would not be found until 2 days later. On the day she went missing, her son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden, would find a cash register empty and bloodied. 8 hours after Gein was seen with her, the last receipt written at the cash register was for antifreeze to their primary suspect, Ed Gein. Soon, police and deputies searched the Gein farms, where they would find a discovery of trophies of human skin, bones, and skulls fashioned into bowls. On the property, police found Worden. Worden was shot, mutilated, and field-dressed in a fashion similar to a deer by a hunter, and in addition to her decapitated corpse, Gein was also found to be in possession of skulls used as bedposts, human skin covering several chairs, and the peeled off and dried facial skin masks from his victims, including women he killed or robbed their graves of right after they died, only going for women who looked like his mother. In addition, police would also find the remains, including the severed head of Mary Hogan, a tavern owner from Pine Grove, Wisconsin, who went missing 3 years ago. But why his mother? What did his obsession grow into? Well, similar to the movie antagonist Buffalo Bill, Ed Gein also wanted to make a suit out of human skin from women who resembled his mother, giving him the ability to crawl inside of her and feel one with his love. Gein would be found legally guilty by criminal insanity and spent the rest of his life in a state hospital until his death in 1984 to respiratory failure. A vandalized grave and ruined lives are what is left of the man known as the Butcher of Plainfield. It was a cold day on December 6, 1989, with students attending their courses at the École Polytechnique Engineering School of Montreal, unknowing that right outside their classroom laid a man hell-bent on revenge. The abuse and seclusion in their life would lead to an attack against a group of people who he blamed his life's misery and failures on: women. This massacre in Montreal would raise concern in Canadian society about gun violence, misogyny, and violence against women for decades after. This deadly mass murder-suicide was committed by a man whose name lives in infamy, for on that cold December day, Marc Lepine would enter the school, separating the students by male and female, and opening fire on the women. In total, Lepine killed 14 women, injured 10 more, and another 4 students were shot and injured, and Marc Lepine would end his life as a coward, misogynist, and full of hate that resonates in too many young men today. Born in 1964 to French-Canadian nurse Monique Lepine and Algerian businessman Rachid Garbi, Lepine would find his family broken by the age of 7. Often traveling across the world as a mutual fund salesman, Marc's father, who was absent at the birth of his own son, was also a womanizer, having an affair while married to Monique. In addition, subsequent abuse to Marc that left marks and wounds on his face would lead the marriage to an eventual separation and divorce in 1971 and 1976 respectively. His father would default on their housing payments, which would lead to the seizure of their home and possessions, and soon, Rachid would cease all contact with his children, refusing to speak to them. The divorce was also fueled by physical abuse Rachid would implement on Monique, forcing her to be his personal secretary, often beating her for something small and insignificant, like a typing error or papers that were not shuffled correctly. Rachid believed women were meant to serve men, to be submissive and do as they're told, a belief that would be instilled on Marc at a young age. For his father's abuse to the whole family, even including Marc's sister, would lead to a broken family, and far too many broken lives. In his youth, Marc showed intelligence but always would seem unable to finish any task he set his mind to. Low self-esteem, lack of communication, and little emotion were shown by Marc as a child, and his seclusion was exacerbated by his sister, who teased him for his acne and lack of girlfriends. This caused Marc's hatred of women to grow. However, in 1981, his sister would be placed in a group home due to her delinquent behavior, eventually dying of a cocaine overdose in 1996 at the age of 28, found in an apartment complex dead, using prostitution to fuel her addiction. At the age of 14, Marc would legally change his name, which was formerly Gamil. This was for reasons most likely tied to his known hatred against his father, and often for being teased by other students in school for being an Arab. Yet with this teasing, Marc would still do well with his studies but fall quickly behind as his self-esteem issues would continue, leading to failing courses and being a social outcast, unable to make more than 1 or 2 friends at a time. This troubled Marc's mother, who at the time was the head nurse for the Hospital of Montreal. She set Marc up in the Big Brother program. This program is a common system set up in many communities where older individuals act generally as a role model for kids growing up in a troubled system. This can either be with sisters, brothers, mothers, fathers, truly any role model. These programs can prove very helpful for the tens of thousands of children in them. However, Marc would remain in the program for just 2 years, as his big brother was detained on suspicion of child molestation of young boys. Despite this, Marc and the individual denied anything happened between them, and soon, Lepine found himself back to being alone. Seclusion led him down a dark path. In his late teens, he became fascinated with World War II and developed an admiration of Hitler, all while remaining good on the surface. helping often at home with chores and working to help his mother. In September of 1981, Mark attempted to join the Canadian Forces at the age of 17, but was denied, later telling friends he lacked the ability to accept authority and showcase difficulty with higher command. And 1 year later, Mark and his family would move to St. Laurent, bringing him what he said in his suicide note as a period of no joy. From 1982 to 86, Lapine would attend university, bouncing between programs and becoming a model student according to his teachers following a brief struggle his first semester at school. However, an unexplained drop in his grades and the subsequent immediate withdrawal of Mark from classes was a shock, as he failed to complete his diploma. Following his failure at his previous school, Mark moved out of his mother's home and applied for a first time to attend the university that would soon become a killing field for Lapine, École Polytechnique. Over the next 3 years, from 86 to 89, Lapine would go through multiple highs and lows, including being fired from a hospital for his aggressiveness and disrespect to his superiors. Mark would also fail to complete courses needed to attend Polytechnique, yet was still able to finish previous courses and get his college diploma. However, after his firing from the hospital he was working at, Mark was different, and he soon began to fly into fits of rage, often referred to as unpredictable, and becoming increasingly violent. Finally, in 1989, Lapine applied for a second time to École Polytechnique. However, he was rejected again as he still did not have the needed courses completed to apply to the program. And in March, he left the last course he was admitted in, computer programming, a course he excelled in. And 1 month later, university admission officers met with Lapine, who was found to be adamant that women were the problem, as they took over jobs in the job market from men. This hatred festered for months as Mark would plan his attack. In August of 1989, Lapine would apply for a firearms certificate, later getting a permit and finally purchasing a gun in November of that same year. For the next several weeks, Mark was spotted on university grounds multiple times, the people unaware of the plot. Lapine started to act very strange in the days before the killings, not paying his rent, buying his mother birthday gifts weeks before her birthday, and packing up most of his belongings. And finally, on December 6, 1989, Lapine would step foot in the university building for one last time. Claiming to fight feminism, Mark walked to the second floor of the building. He was armed with a Ruger Mini 14 semi-auto rifle, a hunting knife, and a suicide note. He entered a classroom and separated the room of over 50 students into groups of men and women. After ordering the men to leave, Lapine shot and killed 6 of the 9 women left in the room. The other 3 remained injured, bleeding out, as Mark casually walked from the class to the other parts of the building, including the cafeteria, corridors, and another classroom. At the end of this bloody day, Mark would end up killing an additional 8 women while shooting a plethora of victims. In total, Mark Lapine would leave the nation in shock, rattled for decades, as 14 women were killed and 13 other students were shot and injured to his gruesome and cowardly act. In total, 28 victims, including Lapine. Lapine would then turn the gun on himself, becoming his final kill. Lives forever lost, changed, altered, simply due to hatred stemmed from abuse and a lack of love and communication. Mark would let his hateful ideas become reality instead of reflecting inward on the monster that he truly would become. If you like videos like this, go ahead and leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.